Picture an ancient battlefield where soldiers are carrying swords, shields, and spears. Nothing too surprising, right? Now imagine one warrior walking toward you with a weapon that looks like it belongs in a fantasy movie, another carrying a giant mechanical crossbow, and somewhere in the distance a massive wooden machine is preparing to launch a stone through the air. These weapons weren't invented for movies, they were real. Ancient civilizations were constantly trying to find new ways to gain an advantage in war, and sometimes their ideas were so strange that they sound completely made up today. Some were enormous, some were surprisingly clever, and some were so unusual that you might wonder what the inventor was thinking. So let's travel back through history and look at 7 ancient weapons that sound fake, but were actually real. Our first weapon comes from ancient Greece, and at first glance it doesn't even look like a weapon. It's called the gastraphetes. The name roughly translates to something like belly shooter, which honestly gives you a pretty good clue about how strange this thing was. Unlike a normal bow, the gastraphetes was a large crossbow-like weapon designed to be much more powerful than an ordinary hand bow. The problem with powerful bows is simple. The stronger the bow, the harder it is to pull the string back. An experienced archer could pull a regular bow using their arms, but eventually there is a limit to how much force a person can produce. The Greeks came up with a clever solution. Instead of relying entirely on arm strength, the user could brace the weapon against their body and use their weight and strength to help draw the string backward. That meant the weapon could store considerably more energy than a normal bow. And this was important because ancient warfare was often about one thing: who could attack the enemy from farther away? A soldier standing safely behind a wall or defensive position could potentially launch a powerful projectile toward an approaching enemy. It wasn't as portable as a normal bow, and it required more effort to operate, but it demonstrated something ancient engineers understood surprisingly well. You don't always need stronger soldiers, sometimes you just need a smarter machine. And the Greeks were only getting started, because eventually they took the basic idea of launching projectiles and made it absolutely enormous. This brings us to weapon number 2, the ballista. If you've ever seen a giant crossbow in a movie, there's a good chance the inspiration came from weapons like this. The ballista was essentially a large mechanical projectile launcher used by ancient armies. Instead of being held by one person, it could be built on a frame and operated by multiple soldiers. Its purpose was simple: launch something with enormous force. Depending on the design, ballista-like machines could fire large arrows or other projectiles across significant distances. And here's where ancient warfare starts to look less like a sword fight and more like an engineering competition. The Romans became particularly famous for developing and using different types of military machines. Imagine approaching an enemy fortress thinking you're finally getting close enough to attack. Then you hear a giant mechanical device being loaded behind the walls. You look up, and suddenly you realize the defenders don't need to come outside, they can attack you from a distance. The genius of these machines wasn't necessarily that they were complicated, it was that they transformed human strength into mechanical power. And that same principle would eventually produce something even more terrifying for anyone standing inside a fortress: the catapult. Yes, we're all familiar with the word, but the real ancient machines were far more interesting than the simple cartoon version. One of the most famous designs was the torsion catapult. Instead of simply pulling back a giant wooden arm with rope, these machines could use twisted bundles of material to store mechanical energy. When released, that stored energy could suddenly propel a projectile forward. And ancient engineers didn't just build one type of catapult. They experimented with different sizes and designs. Some were designed to launch stones, others could launch heavy projectiles toward enemy positions. During a siege, these machines could completely change the battlefield. You could build enormous walls around a city, you could close the gates, you could put soldiers on top of the walls. But then an enemy army arrives with machines specifically designed to attack those defenses from a distance, and this created an ancient arms race. The stronger the walls became, the more powerful the siege machines had to become. The more powerful the machines became, the more engineers had to improve the walls. It was basically ancient technology versus ancient technology. But if you think launching stones was impressive, wait until you hear about what some ancient armies did with fire. Because weapon number 4 is one of the most mysterious technologies in ancient warfare: Greek fire. The Byzantine Empire became famous for a mysterious incendiary weapon commonly known as Greek fire. What made it so frightening wasn't simply that it burned. Fire itself had been used in warfare for thousands of years. The extraordinary part was that this substance was particularly associated with naval warfare and could continue burning even when exposed to water. That made it extremely useful against enemy ships. Imagine being a sailor in the ancient world. You're on a wooden ship, you're surrounded by water, and then an enemy vessel approaches. Normally, water is your greatest protection against fire, but suddenly the enemy begins using a burning substance that doesn't behave the way you expect. The defenders of Constantinople reportedly used this technology to protect the city against enemy fleets. The exact ancient formula has been lost, which is one reason Greek fire remains surrounded by mystery. Historians have proposed different ingredients over the centuries, but there is no universally accepted reconstruction of the original formula, and that makes the story even more fascinating. Ancient engineers created something so valuable that its exact recipe became a closely guarded secret. The technology was so important that losing the secret could potentially mean losing a major military advantage. But while Greek fire relied on chemistry, another ancient weapon relied on something much simpler: a very long piece of wood. Weapon number 5 is the sarissa, and this thing was not your average spear. The sarissa was the famous long pike used by Macedonian soldiers under Philip II and Alexander the Great. It could be several meters long, making it dramatically longer than an ordinary spear. Now imagine thousands of soldiers standing together. The front ranks hold these extremely long pikes forward. Behind them are more soldiers carrying additional pikes. Instead of one soldier attacking another soldier directly, the army creates a wall of spear points. This formation became one of the key features of the Macedonian phalanx. And suddenly, an enemy trying to approach the formation had a serious problem. They couldn't simply walk straight toward the soldiers. There was a whole forest of long weapons between them and the front line. The real genius was teamwork. A single sarissa wasn't necessarily impressive by itself, but thousands of soldiers moving together could transform individual weapons into a massive coordinated formation. This helped Macedonian armies achieve extraordinary battlefield success during the campaigns of Alexander the Great. And it teaches us an important lesson about ancient warfare. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the weapon itself, it's the way an army uses it. But what if you didn't want to fight an enemy army at all? What if you wanted to break through their walls? For that, ancient armies had another strange invention: the battering ram. At first, this sounds almost laughably simple. It's basically a giant wooden beam used to attack a gate or wall. But ancient armies turned this simple idea into a serious piece of military engineering. Large battering rams could be mounted inside protective structures. Soldiers could push the entire machine toward a fortress while staying somewhat protected behind wooden coverings. Then they would repeatedly drive the heavy beam against a gate or defensive structure, again and again and again. It was persistence. Every strike placed stress on the structure. Eventually, a weak point might appear, and once a gate or wall was compromised, the attacking army could attempt to enter. The fascinating part is that ancient engineers understood something that modern engineers still use today. You don't always need one enormous force. Sometimes repeated force applied to the right place is enough. But our final weapon takes ancient military engineering to another level. Because weapon number 7 wasn't just a weapon, it was an entire machine designed to move across the battlefield. The siege tower. Imagine standing on top of a city wall. Below you is an enemy army. You look across the battlefield and notice something enormous slowly moving toward you. It's taller than the soldiers pushing it. It has multiple levels, and it's covered with wood. At first, it might look like a strange building on wheels, but then you realize what it's doing. It's coming toward your wall. Siege towers were designed to allow attackers to approach defensive walls while gaining height. Once positioned close enough, soldiers inside the tower could potentially move onto the walls. The idea was brilliant because ancient fortifications depended heavily on height. Walls gave defenders a huge advantage. Attackers on the ground had to look upward. Defenders could look downward. A siege tower attempted to erase that advantage. Instead of forcing soldiers to climb directly from the ground, the attackers brought their own elevated platform toward the fortress, and that meant ancient warfare could involve something that looked almost like a mobile building. Think about how much engineering would be required. The structure had to be strong enough to support soldiers. It had to move. It had to survive the battlefield. And it had to be tall enough to reach the defensive position. All of that without modern engines, steel construction, or computer calculations. Just wood, rope, manpower, mathematics, and engineering. And that's perhaps the most incredible part of these weapons. When we imagine the ancient world, it's easy to picture people with simple swords and primitive tools, but ancient civilizations were much more inventive than that. They experimented with mechanical power, they developed sophisticated siege technology, they used chemistry, they created enormous projectile machines, they designed formations around unusually long weapons, and they built mobile structures specifically to overcome fortified cities. Their technology wasn't modern, but their creativity was, and that's why some of the strangest ancient weapons in history don't feel like they belong in the ancient world at all. They feel like inventions from a science fiction movie, except they weren't created by fictional engineers. They were created by real people trying to solve very real problems. Because throughout history, warfare has always forced humans to ask the same question: how can we do something our enemy doesn't expect? And sometimes the answer was a weapon so strange that thousands of years later, we still can't believe it actually existed.